We're going to be continuing on in this series, as I mentioned, in seeing Jesus and the signs of Jesus throughout the Gospel of John. This morning, we're going to be in John chapter 9, so you can be turning there. We'll be looking at this miracle of the blind man and how Jesus healed him, what it points to. And even though we're not in a classic Palm Sunday text, there are a lot of things about this passage that point us to Palm Sunday, most namely the fact that in healing the blind, Jesus was declaring something about who he was and revealing that to the world. And there's numerous passages, especially in the book of Isaiah, that talk about when the Messiah comes, he will heal the lame, the eyes of the blind will be opened, and how that will inaugurate or be a sign that the Messiah has come. And so in many ways, this is, I do think, an appropriate text to be looking at for Palm Sunday. And there is a final portion that we're not going to deal too much with in this chapter, but we will talk about tomorrow at our Holy Week service when Jesus declares that he's the Son of Man. And so I hope you'll join us for these midweek services that we're going to have this week during your lunch times around noon, Monday through Thursday. You can come here in person or tune in online. And so we look forward to doing that. But for us today, let's look at John 9. And we are going to read the whole passage, but hopefully it won't be too unbearable as there's a lot going on. It is a really intriguing passage to read through. So John 9, starting in verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some said, "It is he." Others said, "No, but he is like him." He kept saying, "I am the man." So they said to him, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Some of the disciples said, "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." But others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such things?" And there was a division among them. So they said again to the man, "What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes?" He said, "He's a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he is of age, he will speak for himself." His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." And he answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us?" And they cast him out. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And he answered, "Who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." He said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. Now that you say we see, your guilt remains." We have this long account of Jesus engaging with this blind man and the Pharisees, and a lot of it can be kind of confusing. There's quite a lot in here, but we're really just going to focus on a few themes. But sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to be there when Jesus was performing these miracles. As we've been going through this series, I've often thought to myself, what would it have been like to watch Jesus do these things? We have this saying, or maybe we used to have this saying, that seeing is believing. And I sometimes wonder, well, if I was there and I saw what Jesus did, how much stronger would my faith be? How much more would I really believe Jesus' power and give my life to him? How much more would all of us, if we were living at Jesus' time, seeing these miracles performed, believe in him? I think often we just think if only Jesus could come back now today in San Francisco and heal people on the streets, break them out of addiction, lead people to salvation in him, well, then the world would know and see and believe. But I wonder if most of us would actually respond to Jesus more like the Pharisees, in skepticism and disbelief. They asked this blind man 3 times, how did he do it? Because they just could not believe that Jesus could actually heal. They couldn't believe that Jesus was the person he said he was, being the Son of Man, the Son of God. See, I think it's because they were trained in their worldview to think about these miraculous things in a certain way. And there was no way a lowly, sinful person like Jesus, at least in their minds, a lowly person from Galilee of no honor, no status, not of the priestly class, could enact these works of God. And I think for us today, we have a very similar training, so to speak, when we see miraculous things or see things that are hard to believe, whether it be in person, online, or even in person. We've had to fact check. That's become just a common thing these days because of our era of misinformation. And so really seeing is not believing anymore. Seeing actually creates a lot of doubt and skepticism. My social media algorithms have me kind of figured out and know me so well that at least once a day, I will get these ghost stories that pop up on my feed that have something like, "You won't believe what happens next." And it's just clickbait that I fall hard for every time. I don't know why. I haven't learned my lesson, but every time I'm like, oh my gosh, paranormal activity. The first thing that I often do when I go to those videos, I'm watching it, I'm like, oh my gosh, ghosts are real. And then I immediately go to the comments and see what other people are saying. And someone will always quickly say fake, AI. And I'll think, oh, okay, good. So I'm not just being fooled. But we've been trained by our instinct to doubt things that we see because of the internet, misinformation, AI. And so I often think if we were alive at Jesus' time, or if Jesus was alive in our time, I don't really know if seeing would equate to our believing. I don't think it'd be so easy to say that if only we saw Jesus perform these miracles, then we would certainly believe. Because as we've seen throughout the series, Jesus performed miracles and signs all throughout his ministry, and yet the people still did not believe. They saw God in the flesh. He fed 5,000 people out of loaves and fish for a little boy. And yet they still sought and asked, can't you give us another sign? Because in the wilderness, God fed us every day. You only fed us once. So you can't really be of God. So there was something that was trained in their minds to not see Jesus clearly for who he is. And so the point of this series that we've been going through is not to say that if only we see Jesus in the flesh, that we will see and believe, but actually that seeing Jesus requires more than just seeing him with our two eyes. Seeing Jesus, or maybe Jesus revealing himself to us, is demonstrated beyond just physical seeing. And I think that's a main point we're going to see in this passage. But there's another theme throughout, and that's not just of how Jesus reveals himself in the world, but also how does he reveal the works of God? So these are the two themes that we're going to look at in this sermon through John 9, is how does Jesus reveal himself and the works of God in the world? And therefore, what does that mean for us when it comes to seeing and believing Jesus? How does Jesus reveal himself and his works in the world? Well, first, Jesus reveals himself to those who recognize their blindness. Jesus reveals himself to those who recognize their blindness. There's a lot of irony throughout this passage, that the one person that sees Jesus clearly for who he is the one person that was blind. If you look back at the end of the passage we read, in verse 36, when Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? The blind man, or formerly blind man, says, who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. Now think about that. When did he see Jesus? As far as we know, this blind man has never seen Jesus before. Because when Jesus healed him, he told him, go and wash. And the very next people the blind man's found talking with, or the healed man is found talking with, are his neighbors and friends and the Pharisees. Presumably, Jesus removed himself from the situation. And so this man had never actually physically seen Jesus. I think when Jesus says, you've seen him, he's not talking about his physical two eyes. What he's saying is he's revealed himself to you. You have seen who he is. You understand the nature of who Jesus is. And the only way that this man came to that conclusion was because he knew he was blind. It's kind of ironic. You have to recognize your blindness in order to clearly see Jesus for who he is. That's something that Jesus continues on and concludes in this whole point, I think, what he's trying to get at in this passage. In verse 39, he says, for judgment I came into the world that those who do not see me may see, and those who see may become blind. And then right after, he's talking with one of the Pharisees who says, well, does that mean we're blind? And he gives this quite confusing statement. In verse 41, he says, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. What is Jesus saying there? I don't think he's saying that he's talking about sinless perfection or guiltlessness when it comes to sin, that he has no sin at all. What Jesus is explaining is that when they recognize their blindness and they look at Jesus as the one that can cleanse and heal them, then their guilt is taken away. But if they continue to say, we see apart from Jesus, then their guilt remains. See, Jesus is demonstrating all throughout this passage that in order to truly see him, we have to acknowledge that we are blind. We need healing. We confess that we lack sight on our own. Essentially, what Jesus is saying is that faith, or seeing Jesus, begins with weakness. It begins with recognizing that we have a need and not being self-righteous or self-confident, thinking that we need no learning, we need no salvation, we have no need or weakness in our lives. Now, that may seem like a very basic standpoint or starting point of faith, but I'm sure a lot of us know people that are kind of like that. You don't have to name them out loud, but maybe just think about it. Maybe you're one of those people because you don't know anyone else like that, and you're the person people know that's like that, who thinks that, well, I don't need any help. I have everything figured out. I know everything I need to know. And it's striking that often throughout the Gospels, I think it's a testament to this, that it's those who recognize their place of need that come to Jesus. Those that quite literally have needs in the form of physical needs, social needs that are in places of weakness. It's those that think they have it all figured out that don't come to Jesus. See, seeing Jesus starts with recognizing our blindness, and that's a vulnerable place to be because it starts by acknowledging that there actually is something wrong or weak about us. There's something that we cannot fix or deal with on ourselves, and Jesus has to do that we need some help. It's also honestly kind of humiliating because think about it from the blind man's perspective. Well, yes, he was blind and knew he needed healing. Think about all the steps Jesus took to heal him. I mean, this blind man didn't know who Jesus was. He didn't see him. He could only assume based on maybe some reports of other people that this was the Christ or the Messiah or the person that was healing people, but he had to take it in faith because he couldn't confirm whether that was him or not. And then Jesus starts doing some weird things to this blind man. He spits in the ground and makes mud, and then he starts smearing that mud over his eyes. Now, if you were in the shoes of the blind man, if I were in the blind man's shoes, I would probably not be thinking like, oh yes, God, please heal me with this mud made of this random guy's spit that he's smothering over my eyes. He had to go with it. He had to be in such a place where he needed healing that even something that seemed crazy, he went along with it. He went along with this plan that to him seems completely out of the ordinary. But this is exactly the posture that Jesus says his people or we must have if we want to see him clearly for who he is. That's where faith starts. It starts with seeing Jesus by recognizing there may be some crazy things or weird things about Christianity or about God that are out of the ordinary for us. And yet we go along with it, recognizing that we can do nothing apart from God or Christ. And I don't think this is a posture that stops at conversion. I think one of the great errors of Christianity in the modern West is that we think, well, yes, we need to be in a place of weakness and need when Jesus saves us, but after that, we're strong again. We don't need healing anymore. We can be the victor and the triumphant ones. We can have power and strength. One of the greatest errors, I think, in our version of Christian faith in this modern era is that we forget that Jesus calls to him those who are weak and needy. I think that's something that is true exhibited in much of our politics and culture today. Regardless of what side you stand on, people don't like to recognize or acknowledge they're weak and need the help of someone else. Regardless of where you fall, we often like to feel righteous and self-justified. We like to feel as if we're the ones that have everything figured out, that we have the answers, even if it's the answer of salvation in Christ. And our job is to point out to everyone else why they are blind if we are not. But what does Jesus say here? What does Jesus reveal about himself? That it's those who are blind whose guilt is done away with. Those who recognize that they cannot see apart from Jesus. See, there's a posture in the Christian faith that continues on long after conversion, that we are constantly in a place of weakness and need. And Jesus will continue to reveal himself to those people. Seeing Jesus clearly starts by recognizing our blindness, but it's not just about initially recognizing our blindness, but trusting in Jesus alone to heal. Jesus reveals himself to those who recognize their blindness and trust him alone for their healing. See, the constant interrogation of this blind man who was healed reveals this emphasis of Jesus as the healer. Think about all the questioning that the Pharisees have for him. Well, how did he do it? Were you actually blind at birth? How is it that you now see? I think in their minds, they're probably thinking there's no way that an ordinary man could do this. So either Jesus is not an ordinary man or he used some other extraordinary means. There's a constant emphasis on what else did he do? Like, sure, this guy may have healed you, but what did he use? Did he take you to those healing waters of the pool that we saw with the lame man in John 5? But the man just constantly says, he healed me. Yes, he did some weird things, but he's the one that healed me. The emphasis on Jesus doing the healing. It's on Jesus and nothing else that healed him. But I think also beyond the physical healing, there's a spiritual and social healing or restoration, so to speak, that Jesus is pointing to that only he can do here. And I think there's a few signs of that. What I mean by that is just kind of think, why is it that these neighbors or friends of the blind man bring him before the Pharisees? They're talking amongst themselves. Is this actually the man who was born blind? Some say yes, some say no. They bring him before the Pharisees. Now, it could be because they're trying to confirm whether this man is actually the man he says he is. There's some maybe just legal or judicial proceedings to put him on trial to figure out if this is maybe in their minds they're being duped. It's not AI, or it's some magic trick, or it's some false witness. But I think part of it is also because in their day and age, the physical healings were not only about gaining physical functions back, but the social and religious implications after the fact. You kind of think about all these people that were brought to Jesus to be healed. They were the ones who were lame, crippled, lepers, blind. They're often called beggars all throughout the Gospels. This blind man, they call him a beggar. And it's because these were people that were seen to be under God's judgment. This is why even at the beginning of the chapter and at the end, they talk about this man's sin. Because if he was born blind, it was assumed that he did something wrong to deserve it. Look at verse 2 again. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" There was this assumption that physical maladies or deformities or suffering was a sign of God's judgment. And so for this man to be healed meant that God was removing either his sin or his judgment over him. Which also meant that this person, Jesus, they weren't just questioning what he did, but who is it that could even remove this man's judgment and sin? But also we have to wonder, why did Jesus tell him to wash in the pool of Siloam? I often think it's interesting when you compare the different healing narratives or the different miracles and signs that Jesus performs. We know that Jesus could heal with just a word. He did that. We saw that earlier in this series on John 4 when he tells the official's son that your son is healed. The official wants him to come to his home, but Jesus just speaks the words and he's healed. So we know Jesus doesn't need to do all these voodoo magic things to heal people. And I think the reason why Jesus often takes unique measures to heal people is because he's trying to communicate something specifically to the one being healed. And usually he's communicating something beyond just the physical healing. Think about when Jesus touched the lepers to heal them. It was a sign that Jesus is the one who is not made unclean from touching lepers, but it goes in the reverse. He's the one that cleans the unclean. Why is it, though, that he tells the blind man to wash, but not the lame man in John 5? We saw that a few weeks ago. He does not tell the lame man to go wash in the pools of Bethsaida, which were thought to have healing properties. I think it's probably because he wanted to show that Jesus could heal apart from any magical healing properties. He had that power in and of himself, but it still doesn't explain why he told the blind man to wash here. Some commentators, they mention that the pool of Siloam may have had some purification rites or rituals. It had some symbolic nature of purifying oneself in their washing. Even the word that Jesus uses here to go and wash, it's the word used almost 99% of the time throughout both Old and New Testaments of some ceremonial washing to cleanse oneself, whether before entering the temple or entering someone's house. And so most likely when Jesus tells this blind man to go and wash, he's telling him to go and perform some symbolic ritual cleansing or purification rites, so that when he is presented now before the Pharisees, shown that he is no longer blind, that God is not judging him over his sin, he could be re-entered or reintegrated back into this social religious society of Judaism. See, Jesus was concerned in the healings with restoring people back into social life and honor. And yet think about what this blind man did. Think about the way he approached this. If his goal was to be reintegrated back into society, he could have gone along with the Pharisees' judgment of Jesus. He could have played along and said, if I just want to be back into society, be accepted, not be seen as this sinful, shameful, blind beggar the rest of my life, yeah, I'll just go along with it, say, I don't know who Jesus is. Sure, you say he's a sinner, but I'm healed. End of story. Welcome me back into the synagogue. Welcome me back into your Jewish society. But he doubles down and identifies himself as a disciple with Jesus. The irony is that the very reason I think they present him to the Pharisees to be brought back into Jewish society, in his testimony, results in him being cast out yet again when they put him out of the synagogue. Because I think this blind man realized that as much as he could be re-accepted back into society, regain honor, be deemed as righteous again by the Pharisees and Jewish leaders, Jesus was actually the only one that could proclaim that over him, and he already did. By healing him, he saw that Jesus indeed could heal him, but he could also cleanse him. See, the blind man demonstrates something when it comes to this faith of seeing Jesus clearly, that it's not just about thinking, well, I need Jesus, but I also need something else. It's not just thinking that, Jesus, I need him for healing, but yes, I also want social honor back in the world. I think we often think that we need Jesus, but we also need money because that's a form of physical salvation. We need the uplifting that Jesus gives us, but we also need the uplifting that prestige and career gives us. We need the honor in Jesus' kingdom, but we also want the honor in our city and our society. But what this blind man demonstrates is that it's Jesus and only Jesus that can actually cleanse and heal someone. See, he's not relying on anything else in society for this restoration or redemption. He's simply relying on Christ for his hope in healing and restoration. Now just think, if we were to write this story today in our modern lens, modernize the story of the healing of the blind man, and you could take some artistic liberties at this story. If you were to think, well, how would this story end? How should it end? A man who is outcasted, shamed, a sinner, a blind beggar, who's being restored and redeemed. In our minds, how would we write that story to reflect his redemption? I think a lot of us, we love a good underdog story. Reminds us that the nerds can become heroes. The unlikely people can be victors. That those that are ridiculed can now be accepted. But almost all, if not all of our underdog stories end in some sort of material redemption or success. There's one movie in particular I think about with this, and probably because it's based here in our city of San Francisco. It came about 20 years ago now, The Pursuit of Happiness with Will Smith. It's a true story about a man who is struggling in homelessness with a son, trying to make ends meet. He's trying to sell these medical machines to doctors, and he can't sell them enough. He's living in homeless shelters with his son, and he eventually goes through this hardship of struggle and eventually lands a big stockbroker job and goes on to become a multimillionaire. We'll watch movies like that and think like, it's so sweet. It's redemption, right? He went from nothing and now he has everything. And that's the type of redemption story we tend to like. But what if in that movie, I'll just say Will Smith because I don't know the guy's actual name, Chris Gardner, I think is his name. What if in that movie, he comes out of homelessness and he doesn't get the stockbroker job? He's learned some good lessons, but he and his son go right back into the homeless shelters, and it ended like that. Well, we would think that's a pretty terrible movie, not worth making. But I think we would also feel really unsatisfied because in our minds, that's not a good redemption story. That's not a story of restoration. That's a story of rejection. And yet that's exactly what happens here with the blind man. Well, yes, he's healed. He doesn't get the happy middle-class ending that we want him to get. He goes right back into poverty, being cast out of society in Jerusalem. And yet that's exactly the type of seeing Jesus, of following Jesus that requires seeing him, is not trusting that once we come to Jesus, we'll be restored into some good middle-class success in the world, that we'll have some out of weakness will come strength and we'll enjoy prosperity in society. Jesus demonstrates to this man that's really trusting Jesus and Jesus alone for this healing means often that we will be rejected in society. that we'll have to forego or let go of any other honor our society can give us. See, seeing Jesus clearly begins with acknowledging our blindness, but it also extends into recognizing the inability of our society to save us in any way or form. Jesus calls for our full trust in him alone to save. And as we do so, as we see Jesus clearly, this is where Jesus gets to second points. These are the very moments that Jesus chooses to reveal not just himself, but the works of God. Jesus reveals the works of God through those who see him clearly and devote themselves to him fully, to Christ and Christ alone. This is the second point. When he says the works of God, at the very beginning of this passage, he talks about them. We have to wonder, well, what are the works of God? What does it mean that he demonstrates the works of God? He says that about this blind man, he was born blind and goes through all this so that the works of God may be displayed in him. There's some interesting things going on in this passage. There's some confusion first over the pronoun we. If you look at verse 3 again, Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned, but his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." Verse 4, "We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day." Well, who's the we that he's talking about? Some people think that he is talking about himself and the disciples. So he's calling the disciples to join in these works while it is still day. But there's also a question of what does he mean when he says, while it's still day, and then he goes on and says, night is coming when no one can work. And then he continues on, as long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. He's probably talking about some sense where as long as Jesus is here, he will do these works before darkness comes. But the question is, what is the night? What is the darkness? Is it the moment when Jesus ascends and leaves the world and the disciples are on their own? That would feel kind of strange, because how would they continue the works of God after Jesus is gone? They have the Holy Spirit. Won't they continue them? They won't be in darkness. Most commentators believe this is referring to the period of darkness at the cross. When Jesus finishes his ministry and goes to the cross and dies, there's a period where the disciples that we're going to celebrate this coming Good Friday and Holy Saturday, when they are in darkness, in mourning, wondering what just happened to the guy they trusted and believed was their Messiah. And in this period of darkness, then the question then is, well, what are the works of God that Jesus is doing? And most likely he's talking about these works of revealing himself to people up until that point, of revealing who he is before that moment. And there's some other reasons why. One of them is what we saw just a couple weeks ago in John 6, when Jesus talks about the works of God. Talks about them with the feeding of the 5,000, and they ask him in John 6:28, "What must we do to be doing the works of God?" And Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent." And so most likely when Jesus says we must do the works of God, he's talking about leading people to believe in him, revealing himself and causing people to trust and believe in him, which means the we there is probably not actually him and the disciples. The we is most likely him, Jesus, and the blind man. Because of what he says just before in verse 3, he said, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." See, in the blind man's testimony, that he believes Jesus is the one that healed him, and he eventually believes in the Son, Jesus as the Son of Man, he is displaying the work of God by believing in him. It's simply by bearing testimony to who Jesus is that the works of God are displayed. See, the works of God are Jesus creating a new people for himself. I think this also explains why Jesus heals him the way he does. Again, there's a question, why does Jesus go about all these things? He makes mud, he anoints his eyes with it. And probably the clearest indication that points to what these works of God are is that word for mud that Jesus uses. This is a word that could also be translated as clay. It's the word most often used in both Old and New Testaments when we're told that God is the potter with the clay. If you want to look more, we won't go there for sake of time, but in Isaiah 29, verses 15 to 23, you can write that down and look at that later if you want. Isaiah gives us this prophecy that God will open the eyes of the blind and he will form a people for himself by the works according to his hands as a potter with the clay. In forming this clay and anointing the blind man with it, he's showing that this man is his new creation, just like God formed Adam and Eve in the garden in the first creation. This is something that's been attested throughout church history. Irenaeus, writing in 180 AD in his book Against Heresies, he comments on this passage. This is what he has to say about it. He says, "Wherefore also the Lord spat on the ground and made clay and smeared it upon the eyes, pointing out the original fashioning of man, how it was effected, and manifesting the hand of God to those who can understand by what hand man was formed out of the dust. This hand of God, which formed us at the beginning and which does form us in the womb, has in the last time sought us out who were lost, winning back his own and taking up the lost sheep upon his shoulders, and with joy restoring it to the fold of life." See, what Irenaeus is saying about this passage is that in using the clay, the mud, to heal this man, he was forming in the works of God a new people for himself, which means God will display his works through those who see clearly simply by bearing witness to who Jesus is. See, every time Jesus saves people to himself, and every time his people stand boldly on the witness of who Jesus is, the works of God are being displayed. We may think that the works of God should be something a little bit more miraculous, like more healings. I think some streams of faith look at this and will say that, well, the church will continue the works of God just that the way Jesus did. So we'll continue to heal. We'll continue to do miraculous works. But the works of God are simply bearing testimony to Jesus. And while it feels so simple to us, we have to be reminded that anytime people come to saving faith to see Jesus clearly is probably one of the greatest miracles that happens on the face of the earth every moment of every day. Because it's the moment when people's hearts are changed. I was reading this book by this man named Jonathan Rauch, Cross Purposes, where he talks about Christianity's purpose in the world. He's not a Christian. He's a gay Jewish atheist. And one of the things he says about faith and salvation, he has Christian friends. He says, you have something about faith that I feel like I could never have because a switch has to go off for you to experience faith. And that's not happened to me yet. As much as this man recognizes and has Christian friends and has heard the gospel, even he recognizes that coming to faith is a miraculous act of God in changing sinners' hearts and seeing their blindness and seeing that Christ and Christ alone is the one who can save. So friends, when we bear testimony to who Jesus is, the works of God continue to be displayed. We don't even have to know everything about who Jesus is. We don't have to know everything about God and Christ to successfully bear witness and display the works of God. I mean, think about this blind man. When they ask him, who do you say Jesus is? He just says, a prophet. He hasn't even fully understood that Jesus is the Son of Man. Jesus confronts him later and says, do you believe in the Son of Man? He says, who is that? And yet in his simple, small faith of encountering Jesus, he knew enough so that what he says in verse 9:25, I do not know who he is, but one thing I do know, though I was blind, now I see. And every person in this room, if you believe that Jesus can open the eyes of your hearts and you have trusted him for salvation, you have enough understanding and revelation of Jesus to say that, don't you? One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. And the works of God are displayed in you through that. God displays and reveals his works as his people bear witness to him, but the works of God are also finally revealed, and we'll end here, through hardship. Now, that's not something that we often like to hear, but it's through hardship, trial, and suffering that God chooses to display his works in the world. You know, one of the most impactful things about this passage to me is that Jesus chose to use this blind man to display the works of God. I don't know if there's any other healing account in all the Gospels where Jesus says so specifically about one individual, this man will display the works of God. It's through this man, whom all of you in Jewish society think is the most sinful person born in sin, who the Jews end by saying you are born in utter sin, who is probably shamed, despised, rejected in society, seen as the most weak and lowly person. It's through that individual God chose to display his works through. Now, we only see the one instance of healing and victory in this passage. We get a glimmer or a glimpse of the story of redemption about this man. What we don't see is the lifelong struggle he had of being marked as someone in shame and sin. What we don't see is a life of disability that he had to deal with, the life of being rejected, of his parents being ashamed of him. See, Jesus reveals himself to those who recognize his need, but he also reveals himself through those who recognize their need. It's to the weak and lowly that Jesus reveals himself, but it's through the weak and lowly Jesus reveals his mighty works. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians, God will often choose what is weak and foolish in the world to shame the wise, so that the power of God might be put on display. And what that means for us is while we may think God will display his works through us despite the difficulty in our lives, it's actually precisely through difficulty in our lives that God displays his works in us. It's in those moments of hardest weakness and lowliness that God reveals himself and displays his works. See, when we come to moments of suffering and trial, if all we can think are the whys, why, God, did you put me in this? Why was I born into this family and not another? Why do I have to deal with these disabilities or issues that other people don't? We're really no different than the Pharisees, who are asking these questions to get to the why. But God places us on earth with all of our imperfections, sufferings, injustices, precisely so that the works of God may be made known. You know, the very first time that I became aware of this in this passage was actually through some special need parents at my old church, who looked at this and saw that Jesus chose to use a man born with disability to display his works. And so often I think when we think about, if you're a parent of a kid with special needs, it's easy to think about people with special needs as some of the least in society. They have the least to offer. They can feel like a burden sometimes. And yet, what does Jesus say? These people were born like this so that the works of God may be made known. And I think this is the exact message of the cross. That in becoming weak, God reveals his salvation. Through death, he shows life. Through Jesus being shamed, rejected, and ridiculed in society, he shows the love and acceptance of God. It's the very means of revealing his kingdom, that the kingdom goes forth not in strength and power, but in weakness and meekness. That salvation stems from unlikely ways. See, believing in Jesus in the midst of suffering is perhaps the greatest testimony we have to bear witness to the works of God. Because in our trial, hardship, and suffering, when God's people choose to continue to say, Jesus is the one that heals, I don't need anything else in society or the world to heal me. Jesus is the only one that I need to see clearly in my life. That declares something powerful about who Jesus is, even in those moments of weakness. To go back to Jonathan Rauch, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, he writes this when he writes of his Christian friend that was on his deathbed with ALS, a neurodegenerative disorder. He writes, even in extremis, your faith seemed undiminished. I think that was the moment when in all my life, I most acutely felt my own shallowness and spiritual poverty. I saw how your trust in God gave you courage and grace amid an unbearable ordeal. That was to me a more powerful witness on behalf of the Christian faith than any words or argument could have borne. See, even Rauch, this gay Jewish atheist, said that even in those moments of a Christian standing firm, giving glory to God and worshiping him in moments of weakness and suffering was the closest he came to recognizing his need for Christ. You may be wondering throughout this, why does it matter that we see Jesus clearly? It's enough that we see him, are saved, and can't we just go on with our lives? But I think there's something demonstrated throughout this passage where this blind man recognizes that the greatest thing to be gained in the world is not social standing, it's not honor, it's not wealth and riches and success as the world sees. It really is just Christ and his kingdom. And there's something that leads him to worship and fall down at Jesus' feet in such a way. And I think for most of us in this room, if not all of us, there's something in us that wants to experience something amazing, something grand, some good or mighty works about God. I think often many of us will have this longing that we want lives that feel like they matter or that God can do something through them. But there's something that I've been learning through this passage especially. It's that God will choose to work mighty works through those people that wholly devote themselves to him. As people devote themselves wholly to God, even in weak and foolish ways, those are the very people and moments where God will display his mighty works. And so, brothers and sisters, even if you're here just wondering who this Jesus is, would we not be content with a muddy view of Jesus? Would we not be content with a view of Jesus that's unclear or uncertain? Would we not be content with a mediocre faith? But to be filled with the desire to see Jesus so clearly and to see him display his wonderful works on earth, hopefully through our church, but especially in our city.